Welcome to the Reinventing Transport Show, the international podcast that helps you push for better urban mobility and better cities. Hello again, I'm your host, Paul Barter. This time I'm talking with Anjali Mahendra, who is the Director of Research from the World Resources Institute, WRI, Ross Centre for Sustainable Cities. And today we'll be talking about a fascinating and important working paper that she co-authored with Professor Karen Sito, which is called Upward and Outward Growth, Managing Urban Expansion for More Equitable Cities in the Global South. And this report was prepared as part of the process for the World Resources Report, which, as some of you may know, is WRI's flagship publication, and it's entitled Towards a More Equal City. Anjali, what would you say is the most important thing? Let's cut to the chase right away and let people know why they should stay with us and listen on.
All right. Thank you, Paul. Very glad to be here. So I would say the most important takeaway is really how critical urban land issues are, how central they are to almost everything we do, whether it's transportation planners and practitioners. And I should say I myself am a transportation policy person as part of my core background, but also water and sanitation people, those who provide housing, those who provide energy services in cities. How urban land is truly the fulcrum of almost all urban sustainability issues. And why that is so. I mean, how it is owned, how it is transacted, how it's managed, planned, used to deliver services. And the reason that is because urban land is scarce. Because it is scarce, it's valuable. Because it's valuable, it's highly politicized. It's subject to a lot of political influence and power in a city. And that plays very, very directly into the inequities we're talking about that you see manifested in a city. Just sort of recognizing that power that land and land use decisions have to the city's economic future, to its environmental future, is, I think the big takeaway.
There was one stunning projection that was in the motivation section highlighting why this is important as well, which was the prediction that the total urbanized land in the world is projected to grow by 80% between about now and 2030. And much of that will be in Africa and Asia. That's really a stunning projection, especially when you keep in mind that much of this growth will be in precious places like floodplains and ecologically sensitive places.
You're absolutely right. It's going to be in ecologically sensitive places. It's going to be in poorer and lower income countries. Some of our framing work around this paper shows that. It's going to be in countries and in cities where governance is weaker, regulations are weaker, resources are fewer, technical capacity is lower. And I think another important point to keep in mind about that statistic is that land use effects play out over long periods of time. And that is why, when you see a statistic like this, starting now is essential. So I talked about, how the takeaway is that the urban land issues are so important and policies around it. But acting now is also very important.
That's hard for people to get their heads around, isn't it? When we talk about growth of, say, 2%, which doesn't sound terribly large, but when you compound that over several decades, you get enormous change.
Yeah, exactly. And we've gathered the data that shows you it's primarily sub-Saharan Africa, primarily South Asia and some of Southeast Asia, where a lot of this urban growth is going to happen. It's going to happen mostly in cities in the 1 to 5 million population range. It's not the mega cities, but it's some of these smaller cities. And, that is where I think we tend to focus less attention on, but we're kind of missing the urban growth that's happening in some of these other places under the radar.
Right. And that reminds me, I was going to mention another reason why anyone who's interested in cities, no matter which of those silos you mentioned before, should be taking a look at this report and also the data that you link to from the report is there are 499 cities in your interesting database, and there's a fascinating methodology using a remote sensing methodology from the CETO lab, from Karen CETO's laboratory at Yale. Could you say a little bit more about that methodology and how you've got this information on growth patterns, both horizontal and vertical? It's a unique insight into such a huge group of cities.
Sure. So maybe I'll step back a little just to talk about what we did as part of the framing of the overall World Resources Report series. Was the point where we thought, what do we want to say about sustainable cities that is new, that is underexplored? And we focused on this issue of how equitable access to core urban services, housing, land, transport, water, sanitation, energy. Think about all of the ways that a citizen experiences the city, jobs, how solving the problem of inequities in access to these services can create a more economically productive and a more environmentally sustainable city for everybody. And the approach we followed, I would say, is looking purely at demographic and economic data at the city level, I should say, because that is quite hard to get. We had to purchase it from Oxford Economics. But really coming up with how the level of income at which cities are today. And over the next 15 years, we did this in 2015, so 2015 through 2030, the extent to which their urban population growth will or will not keep pace with their urban economic growth. That starts to give you a sense of, how challenging it would be for the city to deal with their impending urban population growth, right? We came up with 4 categories of cities: struggling cities that are low income today and where their population growth is going to far exceed their economic growth. Think of the sub-Saharan African cities, some South Asian cities where the economies are not growing so well, but urban population growth is increasing. There is the emerging cities, which are largely the East Asian cities, again, some Southeast Asian, some South Asian cities where they're low income today. Think of the Chinese cities. The economic growth is keeping pace, more or less, with their urban population growth. Then we have the thriving cities that are high income today, and economic growth is keeping pace with population growth. Many European cities fall in this category. And there are what we're calling stabilizing cities, where you're not really seeing high levels of either economic or population growth, and they're high income today. So really the challenge is not that great. There are other sorts of challenges we need to deal with, like in some of the American cities, they're shrinking in population and so on. 4 categories. Then we started talking with Karen CETO and her lab about how nice it would be if we could see how these different types of cities that we've just described, how they're growing in urban form. How are they growing upward, outward? And if we can try to kind of map that growth across those categories, that was our basic sort of premise to start working together.
That's fascinating. I had assumed that the remote sensing data was your starting point, but in fact, no, that was a method along the way stimulated by the questions emerging from the study. I guess one comment at this point is if the listener's feeling a little confused and mind-boggled by the large numbers of cities and then these categories, actually, one of the impressive things about the report, and there's a video of a session where you explained it, is actually how clearly it does come across. Despite this mind-boggling level of detail and diversity, there are some interesting stories and very clear stories that do come through despite that.
Yes, exactly. I mean, there is a lot of analytics behind it, but once you lay out those cities on a map and you see the striking patterns that emerge, and then we kind of proceeded to the remote sensing analysis to start to look at outward and upward growth patterns in these struggling, emerging, thriving, and stabilizing cities. There's a lot of satellite imagery out there that there's the Atlas of Urban Expansion that the NYU folks have put out that shows you how cities are expanding outward. Satellite imagery is very good at showing you that. But I think what was really a surprise for me, not being a real remote sensing expert, was in discussing with one of the best renowned experts, Karen CETO, my co-author, how urban form data was always seen in 2D form. We didn't even have data on upward growth and vertical growth, the built volumes in cities. And just because there was no tool to do that. So there are researchers trying to do complex shadow analysis on satellite imagery and so on. But she was able to bring to us this data, which is basically collected not through imagery, which is what the horizontal growth, the outward growth data is, not pictures, but it is microwaves bouncing off of the built volume of buildings. And so it's a special tool that's developed, that NASA uses in the US. It's called a microwave scatterometer. And it's that scatter data, that scattered microwave data that was processed by Karen Sito's lab and put into a form that showed us how these cities have actually grown upward. It was relatively low resolution, I should add. But just to say that still gives us two things. Importantly, it shows us how growth has occurred in 3 dimensions across these different types of cities. 2, it shows you intra-city variation in growth. There is strong variation within cities. And maybe the third thing that we carried forward in this report is that this urban growth that you see doesn't come about on its own. There is a pattern in the way the land use regulations are. There is a pattern in the way taxation policies exist. There are certain driving forces that drive that growth in that way. And that's what we dug into further in the rest of the report. So whether or not you have informality in certain parts of the city, whether or not you have upward growth occurring only in certain parts of the city and not others, that's all driven by policies and regulations on the ground.
One thing that struck me, this historical story in places that were more formal sector throughout in the past, played out differently. And for example, transport infrastructure was a dominant influence on the shape and the extension, the expansion in both dimensions. I imagine transport must still be very important as a driving force enabling spread. But this factor of informality seems to cut across and be really crucial in driving some of the trends. Perhaps I'll stop there. What do you think of that comment about informality being really central?
I think you're hitting the nail on the head here. Places that have had a more formal planning process, culture, institutions, however you want to say it, they plan with the land and the infrastructure more in tandem with each other than we're seeing happening and even that actually not as successfully as we'd like, so I should qualify that. But let's say places where you have seen some success, examples of transit-oriented development like the Washington, D.C. suburban area, Arlington, and so on, where the planning of the metro system in the 70s and 80s was done in tandem with considering the land uses alongside and creating economic hubs and so on. That is a very formalized planning culture, which is almost non-existent in many of the cities we're talking about where you're seeing the highest urbanization rates now. And so what you're seeing, that how it manifests is you're seeing formal or informal development coming in well before transport or any other infrastructure services are coming in, right? And the reason, again, is because the governance and planning process plans are made, they're not enforced often. So you're seeing private developers leading the way, leading development. And so you're, of course, faced with all of the challenges of unmanaged urban expansion. It creates the challenges of then trying to connect those locations because development has already occurred, formal or informal, trying to connect them to locations of jobs and other amenities, health centers, education centers, all of that. So if I had to think of actually how this plays out, maybe with the specific transportation example, TOD is a good one because all of us as transportation practitioners, we talk about the amazing benefits of TOD and we need to have density and mixed use around transit stations. It kind of assumes that you've planned out your transit and at some level, basic skeleton of it is planned out and now you're kind of planning the development around it. But that idea, I've often said, turns on its head in some of these developing countries' contexts where it is more sort of transit coming in way later. So it's happening much after the fact, and you're kind of bringing in transit now into places where development has occurred. And suddenly you're hitting issues of maybe there's informal development there. It's too expensive to buy the land, for the public sector to buy the land to do any kind of development activity there or build housing. And you start getting into issues that the land is already very valuable. So when you start to think of who's going to live there in proximity to that public transit, it is actually not going to be the people who will tend to use transit. So it starts to defeat a lot of the purposes of common solutions we begin to talk about in transportation. This fact about development occurring before the infrastructure and transport comes in.
Many of these peripheral, informal areas become accessible via some combination of motorcycles and these minivan kind of modes of transport and various other taxi-like kinds of transport at a sort of an earlier stage in income levels. And that changes things, doesn't it? If you're aware that these areas are accessible, even though there's not much in the way of what we would recognize as formal, hefty infrastructure, nevertheless, at relatively low speeds, people can still get there. But they're facing long commutes from their peripheral informal settlements, aren't they?
Exactly. They're facing long commutes. They're facing high costs because they're often changing modes from one to the other, maybe a bus to, a matatu or something like that, or an auto rickshaw in India. Yeah, if they're not able to actually have access to even the basic bus services or informal transport, then they're buying a two-wheeler in many of these places. And so they're finding, the most affordable mode they can manage. And our next paper that we did after this looked particularly at accessibility issues in the city and the role of transportation modes. The role of the transit system may be best in certain parts of the city, and it needs to coherently coexist in an ecosystem of services. We need to start to imagine maybe an ecosystem of services. Now, of course, there's Uber and all of these other new technology-based modes that we've been seeing. How might you imagine an ecosystem of services where maybe the central dense parts of the city are served through public transit, but recognizing that the city is going to grow? It is not going to stay confined. That was kind of one of the important points we made in this paper. Growth is inevitable in some of these rapidly urbanizing countries. Urban growth is going to occur, so you need to start planning for it now. So recognizing that, maybe you think of the public transit systems role as far as you can within the parts of the city that have the greatest accessibility to jobs and other amenities. But you still need to provide access in the peripheral parts and the growing parts. So maybe that's where the informal transit modes begin to act. You want to set standards for services, but you want to kind of imagine them as a network of service and to recognize the crucial role that the informal providers play today in the city in providing accessibility.
Right.
There are, again, multiple approaches to that too, right? Cities are banning these informal transport providers, or they're, putting in some kinds of regulations. But if you start thinking of them as partners to this vision of providing an ecosystem of services, you'll start to work with them in a different way. Maybe you'll integrate them into your public transport provision plans. Maybe you will think of how certain locations of the city, certain routes can be offered to them, and so on.
Let's circle back to the land use now again and the outward versus upward thing. I'm not sure I gave you a chance to finish your thought to just really very clearly paint the picture of the variation around the world.
Sure, yeah. I'm mindful of going too deep into the weeds and putting people to... Yes, so, maybe I will just try to truly do what you're saying, paint a picture. And here's what we found, which was quite striking, that the struggling cities I mentioned, now remember, we categorize these cities just based on how they're low income today, they have low resources, and the fact that their population growth is just proceeding way ahead of their economic growth. And so they're going to struggle with meeting those service provision needs and so on for a growing population. In these cities, we found, and we looked at data for about a decade between the 2000 to 2010 period, and we saw that there are almost negligible number of pixels, now that was our unit of analysis, showing any kind of vertical growth relative to the entire sample. So I want to just qualify that because, I've heard comments that, I live in Kinshasa or I live in Nairobi, and there are taller buildings going up. The point here is about relative to our entire sample of pixels from around the world, 499 cities around the world, the vertical growth in the struggling cities, and they're not just in Africa, they are in South Asia as well, is negligible. And the reason there is, and when you start teasing out some of the reasons, it is because vertical development actually takes more financial resources. it requires more mature financial institutions. And it actually corresponds to, higher levels of infrastructure development, which these cities don't have. And so that was what we saw for struggling cities. It is primarily outward growth over that last decade, over the decade of 2000 to 2010. Emerging cities, we found also primarily have expanded outward, very little growth that is upward, but there was a good bit of variation. And so, for example, the East Asian cities dominated by China to a great extent. We have a fantastic map in the paper that was an eye-opener for all of us that shows how all of the upward growth in the world, urban growth that's vertical, is concentrated in Chinese cities pretty much, far exceeding the levels in other places. And the Chinese cities are a mix of, what we call emerging and thriving. Some of them are still pretty low income. And then we saw the thriving cities, which show the highest proportions of upward growth. And they again show high levels of within city variation. So, I'm just sort of talking about average patterns here. But yes, the cities that were high income today and that are categorized as thriving are seeing some of the highest vertical growth. Stabilizing cities are seeing all kinds of growth, a lot of horizontal expansion, and we know the problem of sprawl, very car-oriented development. So we're seeing that in some of the stabilizing cities. We've got the 5 clusters of growth, just pictorially showing you the types of growth occurring in different parts of the city. And the new peripheral growth is actually occurring in all kinds of cities.
And we should mention also for people who are urban researchers or interested in digging into the weeds, as you said, the data set is open for viewing, isn't it? And so people can dive into it and to their heart's content.
Yes, they can. One quick thing I should mention is, we looked at 499 cities. There was a lot of this disaggregation within the city, look at patterns and so on. But at the end, recognizing that, again, urban practitioners would benefit from having one metric, if you will, that they can start to correlate with other indicators of the economy, sustainability, equity, and so on. We came up with something called the Outward Growth Index and the Upward Growth Index for these 499 cities. This is available online. And that's what I mean when I say that, vertical growth was amongst the highest in the East Asian cities. I mean the Upward Growth Index values.
Again, here's a very sort of likely confusion, and I notice in some of your writings and blog posts you're keen to head off this confusion, is that some people will jump to the conclusion that upward growth means high density and outward growth means low density, and it turns out that's not necessarily so. But this particular report doesn't talk about density and doesn't have data on density, and so I guess one thing to be just a little bit cautious about is jumping to that conclusion. And just, from my own sort of understanding, for example, somewhere like Lagos or a lot of the large or even medium-sized South Asian cities actually have quite high densities in terms of people per square kilometre. But it's not high-rise, high density. It's tightly packed in maybe 1 or 2 story low-income settlements, often especially in the periphery. Not in South Asia, it's actually mixed throughout, right? But
yes.
So impressions can be misleading. So when we use the word sprawl, someone from North America might have in mind suburban sprawl with very low densities, but the low-rise spread of a city like Lagos is actually high-density low-rise spread. And this is very, very large numbers of people in these settlements, which are very poorly served by all kinds of services. So this is where the equity issue comes in as well. And this contrast between formality and informality comes in as well. Some of the high-rise is in the formal land, but in many of these cities, formal land is scarce. So I'm quoting the report here a little bit. And then that triggers, if I understand correctly, some of your argument, that means that some of the high-rise is not necessarily in locations where it's actually strategic in terms of, say, matching up with services and infrastructure and transport. It just happens to be where there's formal land, and formal land is so scarce and therefore very expensive. It prompts intensive development wherever the financial system is capable of doing that. Sorry, that was a little bit of long-winded, but could you comment on some of those ideas, especially, say, the density issue?
Yes, I will. Thanks for bringing that up, because you're absolutely right. We have a box in the paper that tries to highlight some of the new research in the area, how researchers are starting to unpack what density means. And you're absolutely right. So some of the new work that's coming out on this says about how we pay undue emphasis on this one indicator of population density, when population density actually is broken down. If you thought about it, high population density comes about either because of taller buildings, or it comes about because of high levels of occupancy, overcrowding, many people packed into the same space. It comes about also based on residential share of land versus other uses. And so researchers are trying to unpack that. I saw some fantastic data from, again, the Marin Institute at NYU, where they show, for example, Kinshasa has almost the same density, population density, as Bogota in Colombia. However, the occupancy, and that's the overcrowding, is 4 times higher than in Colombia. So there's a lot of people living in small amounts of space, underserviced, in terms of amenities, infrastructure, but also shows you poor quality of life. And so that is an important point we're trying to get across. First of all, we need to separate what we mean by population density and built form density.
I meet nonprofit members in India who are very suspicious of the formal real estate development industry. And they have reason to be, right? Because it is in many ways corrupt. It's exploiting the scarcity value of this precious formal sector land, and there's a shortage of legal ways to develop at reasonable densities. And therefore, it's people who are ruthless enough to find ways around those rules who are the developers. The answer, very broadly speaking, in your report, would it be fair to say is the problem there is the distortions in the land market, which means that formal sector land is scarce. And if we could make formal sector land much less scarce, we wouldn't have such a corrupt and nasty real estate industry, and we wouldn't need to be so suspicious of them, and then good things would happen. Is that accurate? And as a sort of follow-up, what does a healthy land market look like compared to a distorted one? What are the key features of the two?
Right. Good question. So I would add a few nuances to what you said. What you said is absolutely right. First of all, simply to accommodate the growth that is going to occur in these cities, you need to bring more land into the formal land market, because bringing it into the formal land market allows you to then work with infrastructure providers, services providers, partner with them to service that land. And you need more of this sort of planned and well-serviced and financed land available for housing, more affordable housing, and other needs. Think about transportation, infrastructure, and so on. So the couple of nuances I would add is it's not simply making more of that formal land available. It's also about where it's going to become available in the city and when it's going to become available. And that gets determined by setting a system of regulations in place. And, most developed cities have detailed land use and zoning regulations. But you think of the way land development occurs in some of these growing cities and across Africa, across South Asia, the way it occurs is, let's think of maybe a typical way as, there's an infrastructure project like an airport or something that comes up, and suddenly you're seeing a lot of gated communities, commercial centers coming up around it. The developer may have bought the land 20 years prior to that at very low prices. And they've been able to hold on to that land just because it doesn't cost them anything. And the moment this big infrastructure project was announced, they're able to develop and make a lot of money out of it. And the city doesn't really have a mechanism to capture the value it has created by creating new infrastructure and so on. Yet it's going to have the burden, the city is going to have the burden to provide for this growth that is occurring totally based on the private developers' whims.
Maybe an example would help there, because one of the things I liked about the report is, there's these huge themes and they're very daunting, and we can sort of explain the solution. But, at first I was skeptical that this could ever work in some of these developing countries. And yet then the next thing I read was several case studies of, oh, yes, we can. It has worked in this place, and this place.
Yes. So I'll talk about Bangalore. An airport came up, and this is basically almost 1 hour or 1.5 hours away from the main job centers of the city. And by that, I mean traveling through congested roads and all of that. In distance, it's not that much, but it is significantly far away on the periphery of the city, now you have the whole ecosystem of, gated communities, commercial centers, housing of all kinds, informal settlements to service these formal developments coming up. And you have that part of Bangalore growing most rapidly today. It is so far from the rest of the city that, some people say it's easier to get to a different city than to just get to the airport. And it's a part of the city that actually has very low availability of water, very low transportation connectivity, certainly no public transit. The city is struggling with thinking about a BRT or maybe extending the metro to that part of the northern part of Bangalore where this has happened. Oh, and all of that additional development that is occurring is led by the private sector. That's not to say there may not be a very broad brush plan that growth is going to occur in this part of the city. But the way land is divided, the way services are provided, all of that is occurring in a completely unintegrated way, in a piecemeal way. And we have an interesting map in this report about one of the other critical governance reasons why that is happening. When cities start to expand this way outward, the land development is starting to go into other jurisdictions. And it becomes multiple agencies' responsibility or nobody's responsibility to deal with the service provision aspect of it, right? Whether it's transport or other services. Yes. And so that becomes another problem with this sort of unmanaged expansion. I just want to get back to the main point I was making, which is the where and the when of how this development occurs within the city is very important, and that can happen through proper, regulations. And the examples I want to give you there are some. So that was Bangalore illustrated very well what the challenge is. But some cities, like Mexico City now, have actually learned from the experience of, building low-cost housing way out in the periphery of the city that's completely disconnected from jobs and other services. They've now learned from that experience and have established these, it's not a very nice term, I think, but they call them urban containment perimeters, which is basically to say zones within the city's boundaries, where they are going to direct development, and they're going to make that development conditional on the fact that those developers provide the core services. They're going to find a way to draw the value from those developers for the land that's been provided in well-connected parts of the city, and so on. So they're basically designating locations within the city. Johannesburg does this. Johannesburg has something called urban development zones, where they've planned their transit-oriented development around BRT in tandem with the development of these urban development zones, where they're crowding in, private investment, bringing in developers, working in partnerships with them to build affordable housing, and so on. So it's the where and the when of that development that cities can control through proper regulations. Certainly, that's one of our solutions. Then increasing the supply of formal serviced land. And the third solution we talk about in the paper is, again, recognizing the places where this growth is going to occur and the rampant informality that exists. You see informal settlements. You cannot ignore them. You need to find a way to connect those informal settlements to the more formal services and include them into the formal growth plans of the city, because they're actually affordable settlements with high density. It's all good things, but quality of life is not that great. You need to be able to connect and integrate those developments into the city. And I think with these three solutions, we basically address three key issues that we talked about that we talk about that are challenges in these cities. That land development is speculative, it's unserviced, and it's informal. And through these three sets of solutions, you can start to address all of those three big challenges.
You've been mentioning Johannesburg and Mexico City. These are two of the cities that are detailed case studies, which are separate reports, in fact, aren't they, as well as being boxes within this report and other of the thematic reports. But there are also city-based case studies that are very deep dives into what's going on in those cities, which would be of interest to many of the listeners.
Yes, so our next paper that we did, which was primarily around accessibility and how these land development patterns and the transportation infrastructure that exists is creating accessibility challenges. How might you measure the accessibility challenges for different segments of the population and then think about strategies to resolve them? And so Johannesburg and Mexico City are two case studies where we piloted the methodology and demonstrate basically how this accessibility analysis can be done to come up with solutions. Separately, as part of the WRR effort, As you can see, I've described a lot of these sectoral papers. We've done papers on land, water, energy, housing, the informal economy, and so on. But we also recognize that, we want to be able to study how cities have perhaps made interventions in one or more of these sectors to improve equity and equitable access, and seen broader citywide benefits, economic benefits, environmental benefits over a lasting period of time. How cities have been able to sustain this, what we're calling urban transformation, if you will. And so for that, we actually did a deep case study on Johannesburg, looking at Johannesburg's land use and transport interventions, in particular around its Ria Vaya BRT project, and exactly what I was describing, the development of these urban development zones. How, very interestingly for anybody studying land, how Johannesburg was able to bring about alignment between national policy, provincial policy that it's subject to, and local level policy and precinct level planning at different scales to achieve this vision of what they call the corridors of freedom, where transit corridors provide accessibility to all segments of the population, particularly in a context where entrenched apartheid period inequities continue to exist.
One of the goals we set ourselves as we were planning this interview was to try to get people curious enough to read this report and to highlight to transport folks who are typically already interested in urban planning. They realize that urban planning and transport very much go together. But you said it at the beginning that urban land, which is fundamental behind both transport and urban planning, unfortunately, it's one of those topics that tends to make people's eyes glaze over, and it's hard for people to get their heads around. But it's so important. So, sometimes when I'm asked what's my thing, what is my career all about, and it's often about looking into these boring but really important topics, and it's a bit of a struggle, right? Because it's hard to get people interested in what seem like boring topics, but they're just so important. This is going to make a difference to millions and millions of people's lives, and I just wish people could really get curious enough to read these reports and learn more about how land is so central to everything.
Someone who I respect a lot and is a seasoned transportation professional said to me when I was writing this report that if only transportation people could realize that the best solution to all the transportation challenges we face is dealing with land use policy and dealing with land use regulations in the right way. And, just coming to this topic myself, having had a career in transportation but spending almost 2.5 years digging deep into these land issues, it's really been a wonderful eye-opener of just how central, exactly as you were saying, these issues are, and how little of an understanding we have about how land markets actually function, how little of an understanding we transportation people have about how land markets function and how that has serious implications for our wonderful, transportation policies that we want to put in place, all these ideas around transit-oriented development and density and so on.
One final question to end with. There are these ambitious strategies. We can see that some cities are making progress, but there's a lot of mistakes still being made, and there's a lot of momentum in unhelpful directions in hundreds of cities. Are you hopeful that change can come and that lives can be improved through these three strategies?
I'm very hopeful. I like you. I recognize that it's difficult, and I come from the global south. At WRI Ross Center, we have country teams across the global south: Brazil, Mexico, India, Ethiopia, engaged in sort of the difficult engagement with municipal officials every day around how to sort of reform some of these transportation, land use, and other policies. So I'm completely cognizant of the challenge, but I think there is just so much understanding now, and I would say elevation of issues like climate change and how transportation and land use, urban transportation and land use, has such a strong connection with what countries can do on climate. The SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN, they've been adopted by multiple countries, and countries are going to be held accountable to achieving those goals. There is an urban goal, the SDG 11, that has many of these tenets that we're talking about in our Towards a More Equal City report around equitable access to services, whether it's water or sanitation or transportation. Many of our targets and goals in the SDGs are around that. And so I think there is a greater level of commitment that countries and cities are being held to around climate change and so on. I think that's going to serve, hopefully, as a driving factor for greater action and greater exchange between cities on these topics, between experts and decision makers and so on. I personally should also just put in a word about the fact that we're starting the synthesis phase of everything we've learned in this project, the series of reports on different services that we've focused on and the city level case studies. And we're starting to work on how to advance some of these solutions to action on the ground through our own country teams in the countries we have offices. So I think we're doing that. Others will pick up these ideas. Hopefully, your audience hopefully has some decision makers and practitioners in it, or influencers of policy.
When will the World Resources Report towards a More Equal City, when will that come out?
So I should just clarify nomenclature. I mean, the series is called that, and we've had within it 15 papers, starting with the framing paper that we launched in the Habitat 3 conference in Kyoto 2016, which laid out this categorization of cities and so on, that I mentioned why we're focusing on equitable access as a driver for more economic productivity and better environmental sustainability. But then we went into the sectoral papers that I mentioned, all of those, 7 sectoral papers, and city case studies of 8 cities across the global south. So this set of 15 papers is now going to be synthesized in terms of what have we learned, what are some of the key enabling conditions for these solutions we're talking about in terms of financing and governance, technology and data sharing and so on. So that's something we're just embarking on, and we're going to be holding multiple workshops actually in places like Ethiopia and India to engage with decision makers on the ground around the whole suite of knowledge that's been produced, and finding opportunities that they have in their current decision making where we can perhaps insert these ideas or work with them to design strategies in particular sectors maybe, but in hopefully in a more integrated way across urban issues.
Okay, yeah, I had no idea that the process that leads to a World Resources Report is so substantive and long. Is it always like this?
Yes. I should have mentioned. So what you see here as solution areas in the report, in this one and the other one I mentioned on transportation, and all of our reports. The reason it takes 2 to 2.5 years is because we have done extensive consultation and engagement with experts, with practitioners in the process of coming up with these solutions. And then the report itself, of course, is subjected to very highly rigorous peer review, almost beats many journals I know of, because we're putting this global set of solutions out there, globally applicable, but we want to be very careful that all the right nuance around different contexts and different parts of the world is put in there. And even now, we've done our best, but cities will take these ideas forward, will contextualize them as best as they can to suit their own governance structures, their own, resources, technical capacity, all of that.
Anjali Mahendra, thank you so much for sharing this work with the Reinventing Transport podcast. It's been a great conversation. I really learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. I really appreciate the invitation to join. Thank you.
Don't forget, you can always go to reinventingtransport.org for more information, to listen to other episodes, to find out how to subscribe, or to leave a comment, suggestion, or question. Go to reinventingtransport.org. This has been the Reinventing Transport Show, and I'm Paul Barter. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.